welcome everyone to the second day of what's been so far a fabulous Centennial celebration for Judge Frank Johnson. This morning's program involves ruminations about Judge Johnson by at least two of his former law clerks. And to introduce the program, we have Judge Susan Walker, also a former law clerk of Judge Johnson's, a Yale Law School graduate, and a 23-year so far United States Magistrate Judge.
Thank you, Bobby. Can you all hear me? I'm young. But I still have to have granny glasses and read. I first want to recognize the mayor of the city of Montgomery, Todd Strange, and the chair of the county commission, Elton Dean, and they want to bring you some greetings before we continue with the program. Come on forward, if you would.
For those that do not know, Elton and I served together as the chairman and vice chairman of the county commission. And then when I got to be mayor, he moved up to chairman. And so as we come on most occasions, he's the parent and I'm the oldest child. And it's always a debate who gets to go first, whether he's scolding us or whether we're asking for permission. But I said something to him a bit earlier because I wanted to tell a quick story as we welcome each and every you here, whether you're from out of the state or out of the country or just in Montgomery. This is a wonderful opportunity to showcase Montgomery. It's a particularly great opportunity to recognize Judge Johnson for the heroic things that he did over so many years. He was a hero in so many people's eyes, and unfortunately, not necessarily in Montgomery, Alabama at the time that it was going on. You're in a very historic building. I'm trying to find Sarah Buller. There she is, Sarah Buller, who is the wife and the brainchild, though, of Crest and all of the renovations to Lower Dexter Avenue. It's a person, a group, a family that we've gotten to know from New York, and we relish her being here today because this is her vision for what the redevelopment of Lower Dexter. And I wish I could tell you why she's here this time, in addition to being here for the Frank Johnson seminar, because she's got a marvelous project that will be announced in the April timeframe that's going to continue to revolutionize downtown Montgomery, put Montgomery again on the map. And I just tease you by saying this. When we finish this in April, Nelson, you don't even know about it yet. When we finish this in April, we'll have something that nobody else in the entire world has. And the eyes of the world will be on Montgomery, Alabama. Enough about that. What I did want to say is about 8 months ago now, maybe 10 months ago, Elton and I participated in the rededication of this space. If you get a chance today on the first floor as you go out on Monroe Street, which is a wonderful historical avenue in Montgomery, you will see on the wall two marble stones. It has holes in them, and it has white and colored painted on it. Those were the backdrop for the fountains that were here at Crest Building. And when we bought Crest, the issue came up was, what are we going to do with those stones? What are we going to do with where those fountains were? What are we going to do with the symbolism of what was going on in that period of time? We kept them. But we made it a condition that if you, in fact, bought this building, that they would somehow have a role in this. And so when we dedicated that, the signs were up there, and Elton and I were there. And we literally were holding hands. And as we saw and as we remembered what those stones represented then, It's a different representation today because they're side by side. They're in partnership. They're in unity and in union. And that's what Montgomery, Alabama is all about. It's what Martin Luther King talked about to that beloved community. We're trying to get there. I don't know when we will get there, but we'll know it when we do. And Elton Dean and I have been partners when city and the county and our county commission and our city council have endeavored to do everything we can to make this the city that we call the capital of dreams. Elton?
Good morning. This is a very touching morning when we talk about where Montgomery was and where it is today. And oftentimes when I get a chance to speak in front of a crowd, and I think I said it at Dexter the other morning, 1955 was their Montgomery. Today is our Montgomery. Now, he didn't tell you that in front of those two signs where it said white and colored, that I put him in front of the colored. And I got in front of the white. And that's what you have to do. You have to exchange. If you want to understand what's going on, what needs to happen, you have to exchange roles. Let's not play with it. And I can honestly say that when you talk about what's Martin Luther King, he got tired. He was a God sent. And all of you in Montgomery, right, you're sitting here now are God sent people. And the reason I know that because you would not be here thinking about what happened then and are interested in what's going to happen tomorrow. But with the kind of people that you are, we all are family. We all bleed the same way. We got to be serious about what we're going to do. I was talking to my partner, Doug Singer, that on the commission. He said, we really got to change. People talk about change, but we haven't changed. So it's going to be left up to us, the people in this room, to initiate change. We all serve the same man up above, and he expects more than we have given him thus far. So I challenge you and welcome you here this morning. Let's go out, hold in hand, and say, neighbor, I love you. Thank you.
I thank you both. On behalf of the court, too, I want to thank Sarah Beatty Bullard and her husband, Mark Bullard, for so graciously letting us use this facility today. We very much appreciate the opportunity to do that. Thinking about the breakfast that we've been enjoying today, including Natalie Dupree's amazing biscuits, the recipe at least, interpreted by Jenny Weller, I'm reminded of having breakfast with Judge Johnson. As Bobby said, I was a law clerk in 1985, and also with his marshal, Wendell Elliott, in Atlanta before a sitting back when I clerked for the judge. And I can tell you all that Judge Johnson was as fond of a good pork product as anyone. He tucked into his link sausage and his bacon that morning, as I can recall, with considerable gusto. And I couldn't muster the same enthusiasm. And the reason for that is that I had been up since 5:30 that morning. You had to beat the judge downstairs. That was the rule. And at the Ritz-Carlton, you had to have his newspaper, and you just had to be there by the elevator when he turned up. And my co-clerk, Rob, who's here, will not be surprised that I had learned the hard way the morning before that was the rule, because I was not there. So the following morning, I was there bright and early. I'd been up since 5:30. I was there at 6:30 when the judge came down, but I just wasn't myself. I hadn't gotten any sleep at all. Well, before that breakfast, a while back, I had told the judge that when I was growing up in East Tennessee, we had a big vegetable garden, and behind that there was a neighbor's farm. And on the farm, as children, we used to climb the barbed wire fences, and we played in the creek, and we ran from the cows, and we played in the big barns and in the corn crib. And somehow I don't think he was that impressed by my credentials as a farmer. So that morning, he took it upon himself to tell me what a real farm, such as the one he grew up around in Winston County, was like. Now, y'all already know I was in a weakened state. So when he started on a really detailed and graphic description of butchering hogs as I ate my sausage, with all the eviscerating and the boiling and I don't even want to think about it, while he enthusiastically consumed yet another link sausage, the most I could muster was this very weak response. I said, Judge, you used to cook and kill the hogs? And this is what he said to me in his most serious tone, and I'll never forget it. He said, Miss Susan, it's cruel to cook them before you kill them. So he never missed an opportunity for instruction. I duly noted the point. I want to introduce to you some others who have had, I think, similar experiences or better ones. They clerked before I did when Judge Johnson was on the district court. And I need to look at these notes to make sure I do it right. Let's begin with Cathy Wright. She clerked for Judge Johnson when, again, he was still on the district court from 1975 to 76. And thereafter, she was a founding partner of Maynard, Cooper, and Gale, and then a founding partner of Claris Consulting Group, where she was a consultant for a very wide range of businesses, governments, and nonprofits. She was also a founder of the women's section of the Alabama Bar Association and the creator of a diversion program for girls in the juvenile justice system. Cathy was one of those clerks that you heard about. You'd hear about the good things that she had done, and all of us clerks who followed would hear that name. I don't remember anyone ever saying anything good about our next guest, David Bagwell. I'm kidding. David graduated from Vanderbilt. He actually grew up here. He graduated from Vanderbilt in 1968, and he traveled around the world for a year on a Corning traveling fellowship, studying international business. After that, he went immediately into Army boot camp, and he says the Army taught him how to type and how to bayonet people, and that those two skills he found important to modern law practice. He graduated second in his law class. He clerked for Judge Johnson shortly before Cathy did in 1973-74, when Judge Johnson was chief judge of the Middle District. David was a lawyer and a judge for 43 years in Mobile and Fairhope in two big firms and one medium firm. And he says he was finally alone at the end, which was the only time he liked all of his partners. The last thing to tell you about David is he, like he was also a United States magistrate judge, we're now called, from the Southern District of Alabama. He says later he ran for federal judge 3 times, and each time he lost by only 3 votes: the president and both senators from Alabama. So please welcome Cathy Wright and David Bagwell to talk about their experiences with Judge Johnson.
Thank you, Susan. David, when we were talking about doing this program, David asked me if I wanted to go first, and I said I did because I know better than to follow David. Because as you can see already, he's very funny. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then David will, and then we'll just talk a little bit and hope to have those of you who have stories and comments join us as well. Because it's really an honor to be up here, to even be here, but to be up here. And I certainly know that most of you in this room could sit in these chairs and tell stories about Judge Johnson as well. So we'll do what we can. As Susan said, I clerked for Judge Johnson 75, 76, along with my co-clerk, George LeMater. Happy birthday, George. And we arrived there. It was kind of in the midst of the administration of the Wyatt cases, the mental health cases, and the prison case, the prison conditions case came in shortly after we did. So that case was filed, tried, and put into implementation during that year that George and I were there. And it's not lost on us that, as we sit here today, Judge Myron Thompson, who I guess carries Judge Johnson's legacy as well as anybody I've ever known, is hearing cases again. And I can see Anil back there. And my sister also is one of the plaintiff's lawyers in that case. So that's 40 years ago, and it's different, but it's the same. So it's just an interesting irony. When Debbie asked me if I would participate in this panel, she said we were to think about Judge Johnson as a person, not so much his legal theories or his rulings, although obviously those are very much intertwined, but what he was like as a person. And I thought about it quite a bit, and to me, there were three characteristics that really defined Frank Johnson as a person. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those sort of as a frame for the stories. And the first one that was obvious to everybody was an absolutely piercing intelligence. And those of us who clerked in the district court, and will be over there this afternoon, his office was as palatial as any CEO or government official I've ever known. And so when you would walk up to his office, first you'd have to get past Miss Perry, who had X-ray vision and would stop you in a heartbeat if you didn't have a good reason for bothering the judge. And then the ceilings are about as high as they are in this room, and there were these wood panels that were in front of the judge's office, and the doors were so heavy that I always felt like Edith Ann, Lily Tomlin's character, trying to open the door. And the office itself was about 3 football lengths away from his desk. So if you walked in and he was seated at his desk, you had to walk that whole 3 football fields under the stair. And, oh my Lord, it was terrifying. But if you ever appeared before Judge Johnson in any capacity, as a law clerk, as an attorney, whatever, the stair. And it was, I don't know whether it was that he had sort of steel gray eyes, and so that expression, steely gaze, he had it. And, or I don't know if it was that, or he had full caterpillar eyebrows. And so, he would look at you over his glasses. And what I came to understand is when you got that look, it meant there was something that was painfully and immediately obvious to Judge Johnson that you had completely missed. And he was waiting for you to catch up. And he was pretty sure you wouldn't. And he was going to have to explain it. So when I talk about intelligence, I'm not talking about, the valedictorian or 1600 on the SAT, although those are good things. But it's a kind of quickness of mind that escapes us ordinary mortals many times. And an example, sort of unrelated to Judge Johnson, my husband Mike, who's here, is a history buff, and we were in Charleston, South Carolina, earlier this year, Mike was saying that George Washington, as president, visited Charleston. And when he did, he looked out into the bay off Charleston, and he said to the city fathers, "You need to build a fort right there." But they said, "But President Washington, there's no land there." And he said, "I know, but that's where the fort needs to go." And so that's how they built Fort Sumter. They had to build an island. It was strategically located. And Judge Johnson was like that. I mean, his mind was so quick to go to the crux of the matter that wouldn't occur to you necessarily in a million years. And when I think about him, I think, you know, growing up, probably by the time he was in junior high school, he had already figured out that he was way out ahead of the rest of us. And, you know, lest you think maybe that was because he grew up in Haleyville, Alabama, I must tell you, I've known a lot of really smart people from Haleyville. And I think it would have been the same thing if it had been Cambridge or Palo Alto. He was just a brilliant man. And one of his favorite stories that he loved to tell was when he first got on the bench, with one of his first jury trials, there was an old farmer who was sitting on the jury. And after the trial was over, he, the farmer waited and wanted to speak to the judge. So the judge came out to say hello to him, and he says, the farmer said to him, "You know, Judge, you're a right smart feller. You ought to come down to our town and put you in a little grocery store, and I think you'd do real well." And the judge would go, har, har, har. So he, you know, he was so quick, and I think that really, really defined him in a lot of ways. And that quickness of mind leads, I think, to two things. One of them is that it makes you keep your own counsel, and he certainly did. And I remember my first walk down that office to his desk. Unfortunately, this time he was somewhere else. Well, first of all, you go around the back of the desk, and Mrs. Perry had warned us sternly that we were to never, ever touch the brass spittoon that was behind his desk. And he had taken up chewing tobacco, and so you would kind of go around and hope you didn't kick it over. And you know, the only thing I ever saw in there was this sort of viscous brown liquid, but it was like something out of Hogwarts. But anyway, so I went around the desk, and there on his desk he had a paperweight. It's about like a little glass paperweight, about that big, and he had taped to it, underneath it, this quotation, and I want to read it from Abraham Lincoln, that says, "I do the very best I can. I mean to keep going. If the end brings me out all right, then what is said against me won't matter. If I'm wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right won't make a difference." And that seemed to me to be his credo, the principle that he followed, that, you know, that conviction to do the right thing as required by the Constitution, not what he thought was the right thing, but what he saw in the Constitution was his commitment. And you all know, without me telling you, that at great personal cost, he did that over and over and over again. And the second thing I'll say about where his intelligence led him was he was just incapable of groupthink. I don't think it ever crossed his mind, you know, that he should think the same way everybody else did. Part of that, of course, was his Winston County heritage. And I want to say that upbringing there really prepared him in a lot of ways for what he was to face. And, you know, many of you know that it was the free state of Winston, and he grew up as a Republican in what at that time was very much a Democratic state. But there was something else about it that I think was really important, and that is my parents both were from North Alabama, actually the other side of Alabama. But that part of Alabama is, you know, the foothills of the Appalachians. And for example, when my parents grew up, it was a very white place. And so I'm not saying it by any means that those parts of Alabama weren't racist. Of course they were. But it was almost more theoretical in a lot of ways, because it was almost exclusively white, those counties that are across that part of Alabama in those days. And so I think when he came to Montgomery, the experience that the rest of Alabama had lived was more of a shock to see, because it wasn't the experience he had lived in growing up in Winston County. And so I've heard many people say over the years that they felt like one of the prices that Judge Johnson paid for his commitment to the Constitution was a social isolation. But the truth is, while there were many people around everywhere who reviled Judge Johnson for a time, the Johnsons actually were not socially isolated. They had many friends. Trey Granger told me about the oral histories that are on the website for the Middle District of Alabama, and they're wonderful. I didn't know they were there, but I watched the almost 3-hour interview that David Whiteside did with Ruth Johnson. And she talks about moving to North Hart Drive in Montgomery and all of the friends that they made, and people who stayed their friends throughout this whole ordeal. And they had a wonderful social life. And I know, David, you have much to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. I wish Cathy would keep talking because she's doing so well, and it would spare my having to say anything. All right, I grew up in Montgomery. I graduated from Sidney Lanier High School in 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. In those 10 years, the Montgomery County Board of Education did not place one single white child in a black school or one single black child in a white school. So it was a completely segregated world I grew up in, and I was well aware. I live near Mobile now, but I was well aware of what a lot of people thought about Judge Johnson, a lot of white people. And I'll tell you one quick story. Todd Strange has alluded to the fact that he was not universally popular. And when I was a clerk, I used to go down to have lunch whenever I could at the Elite Cafe. Y'all remember the Elite, owned by Peter and Ed Zaides. It was a wonderful place, and I would sit at the counter where there was a kind of a 50-ish-year-old white woman named Ruby who was the waitress there. And I came in always in my navy blue or gray suit and white shirt, and very conservative. I was in the National Guard at the time, very conservative haircut, and she was every father's dream in 1973 of what a son should look like. And I ate there, and I got to know Ruby a little bit, and finally she looked at me and said, "Do you mind if I ask what you do for a living?" And I said, "Sure, I work for Judge Frank Johnson." And her eyes got that big, and she stepped back about 3 steps and said, "Lord God." So if I didn't know Judge Johnson was not universally popular, I certainly knew it when I was eating at the Elite Cafe. I'm going to mention a couple. I'm going to tell a couple of stories, but it's worth saying some surprising things about Judge Johnson. If you didn't know, one was I clerked, I think, the year he more or less stopped smoking and took up chewing. But when I clerked for him, most of the time he was smoking Home Run brand cigarettes. He said he did not smoke picayunes because they were too harsh. And his sister, who had a drugstore in York, Alabama, or somewhere like that, would send him a shoebox full of Home Run cigarettes every week. And he would go down and pick it up at the post office and come back and smoke them. And it's worth saying, too, here's how he was a fundamentally conservative human being. We're all accustomed to thinking that Judge Frank Johnson was the ultimate liberal, and in some ways he was, but in many ways he wasn't. He told me one time, he said, "David, when I was a lawyer trying cases in Jasper, Alabama, I never changed my suit during a trial, no matter how long the trial went." And he said, because most of the jurors didn't have any suits, and if they had a suit, they didn't have but one suit. And he said, I didn't want them to think that I thought I was better than they were, which was just a remarkable, to somebody like me, that was just an amazing story, and I think it explains something about him. Now, there was never anybody more serious. I'm going to touch on 2 explanations. Judge Johnson was a terrific natural comedian. He had a fantastic sense of timing about how to tell a story and how to get the punchline just right. He also, he was a mix between a gregarious guy with friends and a real loner. He also had a loner side to him. When he got shunned by the First Baptist Church and by the country club, he said, you can't shun a fisherman. He loved to be alone, and I learned quickly from Miss Perry, if nothing else, not to just, I knew not ever to go in and sit down and start telling stories and jokes with him. I quickly figured out he didn't want me in his office, but if he wanted to be friendly and tell some stories, he would come sit with me out in where I sat. So he was the best joke teller ever. Some of his jokes were a little off color. Mostly when that was the case, he was quoting somebody else, ordinarily Governor Jim Folsom. Nobody told Jim Folsom stories better than Judge Frank Johnson, and the judge and his brother Jimmy were apparently big buddies with Jim Folsom. He has some wonderful stories, and if we had an hour, I'd tell you a couple of them. But the trouble with telling those stories is nobody can tell them like Frank Johnson, and I certainly can't. I'll tell you one quick joke that he told me that I don't think I can mess up, and it shows everything about him was country, kind of country. He liked to emphasize country. And he said, did I know about, he said in Jasper, Alabama, where he practiced law, there used to be a house of ill repute. And he said, the University of Alabama School of Social Work sent a master's degree candidate down to interview the women in the house of ill repute. And said one of them came in and found the first woman there and said, "Ho lady," Judge Johnson called her Ho lady. "Ho lady, how did you get to be in this place?" And she smiled and said, "Just lucky, I guess." That's the kind of joke he would tell, okay? It might be a touch off color, and he almost never used humor in the courtroom. However, when I was a clerk, there were 2 cases where he used humor without ever smiling at all, and not everybody in the courtroom was clear that it was humor at the time. Phil Butler's here somewhere, who was also in my high school. There he is right there. Phil and Bobby Siegel and I were in the 1964 graduating class of Sydney Lanier High. But when I was clerking, Phil was a young lawyer. He had what he thought was a pretty good personal injury case, and he was trying it with the presence of David Byrne, who really wasn't helping much. Phil was trying the case. It was being defended by Charlie Porter. Is that right? Charlie Stakely, maybe. Charlie Porter, and also Robert Huffaker. They were defending it. The Neptune Meter Company, I think, was the defendant, which is in Tallahassee, I think. And so they were up there, and the plaintiff, Phil's client, was on the witness stand, and Phil's client had testified in a completely different way at the trial, under oath testified, from the way he had testified in his deposition. And Huffaker was up there asking him about it and doing a good job of cross-examining. He said, "Now, Mr. So-and-so, you testified at your deposition under oath that X, and here you are in the trial testifying under oath that Y, and those are 2 completely things." He said, "Yes, sir." And he said, why did you change your story?" or words to that effect. And so the guy just kind of mumbled, and he said something like, "The Lord come to me in the evening." And the senior defense lawyer, who, like me and like some of us here, was a little hard of hearing, didn't catch what he said and said, "What'd he say?" And so meaning, "Please, Huffaker, tell me what the guy said," because I didn't hear it. However, the witness thought that Charlie was asking, what did the Lord tell him when he come to him in the night? And said, "He come to me and told me that unless I changed my story, I wouldn't win this case." And immediately a woman juror, who was a retired teacher from Fort Deposit, started just laughing uncontrollably. And Judge Johnson excused the jury and told them to come back in the morning. But before the lawyers left, he said, ordinarily when a witness changes his story, and it's completely no smile, no nothing, 100% serious, ordinarily when a witness changes his story, I give the other side a chance to look at the piece of paper or whatever it is that caused him to change his story. But here, the Lord is not within the jurisdiction of this court, and I'm not able to do that. And the second thing is, this is hearsay evidence coming from an unimpeachable source. And he said, we're going to reconvene with the jury at 8 o'clock in the morning, but at 7:45, I want the lawyers to be here with briefs because we're going to argue about those two legal questions. And they went out, and Butler told Huffaker something like, I ain't going to do that, or words to that effect. So I went to the judge and I said, Judge, you shouldn't have done that. There's going to be some poor lawyer at the Rushton Stakely firm staying up all night working on this stuff. And so he just laughed, smoking his home run cigarettes. And the next morning, Huffaker came in with a brief and a Xerox stack of cases that big. And the judge never mentioned it, just went on. And so I'm very sad for Phil that there was a defense verdict in that case, and Phil had worked on that case very hard, and it was not his fault. But that's occasionally there would be a flash of fun with a guy like Judge Johnson in the court. And I'll give you one more short example, shorter. Somebody filed, a bunch of Washington antitrust lawyers, and this antitrust was a lot of what I did as a lawyer, filed an antitrust case in Montgomery, which is very unusual. The Kershaw Manufacturing Company, which makes railroad equipment, had bought an axle company and become the 5th biggest axle company in the country. And these Washington lawyers came in and filed an antitrust suit. Among the other defense lawyers was Tommy Thaggart, a really good lawyer in Montgomery. And so the Washington lawyers came in and they were arguing for divestiture, which was not at all clear could be done at all, and they wanted it done on what they call a temporary restraining order. In other words, this is such an emergency, you have to do it without even listening to both sides. And so the judge listened a little while, and he got bored, and he said, it was under the Clayton Act. He said, by the way, you may not know that the author of the Clayton Act, Henry de Lamar Clayton, was a district judge in this district. And the lawyers, they knew the judge was getting bored. And so, no, sir, we didn't know that. And then they started talking about what would happen in the case. Their view of it was it would go on for a decade. There would be waves of discovery. And in Judge Johnson's court, the only waves of discovery were light waves. And finally, Judge Johnson said, well, I'm very conservative on temporary restraining orders, and I deny yours, but you have convinced me this is a real emergency, and we're going to go to trial in 31 days. And so the pale lawyers from Washington, D.C. turned even paler. Tommy Thaggart laughed and said, you guys got more relief than you even asked for. And so once again, I went into the judge who was laughing, smoking his home run cigarettes back in his office. I said, Judge, you know they're going to dismiss this case in the next 30 minutes. He said, yeah, but before they do that, Thaggart will come in with an answer, and they'll throw a monkey wrench, and they can't do it without my permission. Which all happened. But that's the kind of thing, he could have fun with cases and yet be completely serious in lots of ways. He just was a wonderful guy to be around. He was so smart, so fun, and it's worth mentioning how much fun it was when he was on the trial court and he would travel to Dothan to hold court or somewhere. The law clerks would go, the U.S. Marshal would go, the court reporter would go, and everybody would get in before dinner and have a couple of drinks of bourbon. And more of these stories would be told, more stories about Big Jim Folsom, more jokes and some whiskey drunk. And there never was anybody more fun than Judge Johnson on the road. I have not been timing myself. I'm going to tell one more quick story. In the time when I was a law clerk, and from 1910 to 1976, let's put it this way, there was such a thing as a 3-judge district court. And it actually is kind of interesting in the Trump times. Now you have conservatives running up to the 11th Circuit to file a lawsuit, hoping they'll get a conservative judge, and liberals going to the 9th Circuit, hoping they'll get a liberal judge. And the same thing happened in 1910 when all the progressives were passing. Ed Bridges, you ought to tell the story, not me. The progressives were passing, including in Alabama, various statutes regulating prisons and railroads and all kind of stuff. And conservative individual federal judges were striking them down as unconstitutional. So Congress in 1910 passed a law saying if somebody's trying to enjoin a statewide state statute or a federal statute, you have to convene a 3-judge district court, which would be 2 district judges and 1 court of appeals judge. And a lot of what we did, keeping in mind that all of these things Judge Johnson gets a lot of credit for, most of them were 3-judge court cases with Judge Johnson and 1 other district judge and 1 court of appeals judge. Sometimes Johnson dissented, sometimes he wrote the opinion, but when the court of appeals judges seemed to hate it for various reasons. They didn't like the process, and one time, and the process was the district judge to whom the case was assigned would write a letter to the chief judge of the circuit and say, "This is clearly a 3-judge court case. Please convene a 3-judge court." Well, Judge Johnson would sometimes ask the clerks to write these letters, and I wrote up one, which he changed a little bit and sent to John R. Brown, the chief judge, and said, "For all these reasons, we ask that you convene a 3-judge court." And Judge Brown wrote a letter back and said, "For all of the reasons outlined in your letter, I agree that this is not a 3-judge court case." and actually, Judge Brown and Judge Johnson were kind of water and oil, and they didn't mix so well anyway. And so Judge Johnson and I looked at it and said, "This is just crazy. It's just crazy." So Judge Johnson went in, closed the door in his office, and I could hear a bunch of real loud talking, but I stayed as far away as I could. And after about an hour, he came out and his face was red, and he said, "Sometimes you have to talk tough to the chief judge of the circuit." And the 3-judge court was convened in the case. All right, that's enough stories. Get some questions or. We can keep telling stories for as long as we have, but somebody, y'all want to ask questions or make comments? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Gentlemen.
Oh, well, I'm glad you asked. We talked about that some last night at a dinner with the clerks. Governor Wallace and Frank Johnson. Oh, yeah. Thank you for saying that. The question is, what was the relationship between George Wallace and Frank Johnson? Mostly bad. It's a longer answer than that. They were in law school together, and they were friends. They were good friends. Remember that George Wallace at the time was viewed as a liberal and one of only 2 Alabama delegates to the 1948 Democratic Convention who did not walk out with the Dixiecrats. The other one being Jimmy Faulkner from Bay Minette. But Wallace and Johnson were in law school together. They were friends. On Judge Johnson's wall in his home when I clerked was a photograph of Judge Johnson and Ruth. They were already married then. And George Wallace and Lurleen, and Glenn Curley, who later was the DA in somewhere like Autauga County, and I never knew his wife. The 3 of them in what I recall to be formal clothes, like tuxedos, at some dance the law school had. And he said they really were very close until the problem came up with the voting records of Barber County. The story that I remember he told there was that the call came in last night. George LeMaitre said Mrs. Johnson answered the call, but it was George Wallace. Well, the judge told me that when they agreed George Wallace could come and they could talk, the judge said Wallace came to the door and said, "Judge, my ass is in a crack." And Judge Johnson told me that I said, "Come on in, Judge, and we'll see if we can get it out." And they worked on it and worked out something. And George Wallace said, that's when George Wallace, of course, said that Frank Johnson had lied about it, was a carpet-bagging, scalawagging, integrating liar, or the words actually were worse than that. And that's the barbed wire enema comment Wallace said about Frank Johnson, too. But, toward the end, they didn't have a relationship, I guess.
Yeah, and if you watch the interview with Mrs. Johnson that's on the court website, she tells that the story as David relates it, and she says that toward the end of his life, George Wallace called her and apologized for everything he had said and about Judge Johnson. They had been very good friends in law school before George Wallace decided it was more important to be governor than to be decent. And so he did, at the end of his life, let Mrs. Johnson know he regretted what he had done. Judge Johnson? You know, the question is, was he more conservative than George Wallace at the time? You know, I'm so glad you asked that. Judge Johnson kind of defied labels. In this world we live in today, that's a good thing for all of us to remember. But Judge Johnson was personally quite conservative. The way he lived his life, and he just lived according to very traditional values, I guess you'd say, or as what they were at the time. But he believed so strongly in the Constitution. And he felt like if the Constitution said that there should be equality or there shouldn't be cruel and unusual punishment, that was what it meant. And so he was so strongly committed to doing what he felt like was constitutionally required. And it was that kind of integrity, I think, more so than what you could call liberal or conservative. He believed that the Constitution meant that people were to be equal and treated well. And I was saying how his background growing up really stood him in good stead. At Winston County, and Mrs. Johnson also says this in her interview, that Winston County was originally settled by revenuers, by moonshiners, and they did not love the government. And there was very much sort of an anti-government sentiment, in that part of the state. And but because of the way Judge Johnson was, he was so bright and had so much integrity. He felt like that if you were in a position of authority, if you were a government official or a lawyer or a judge, a law clerk, if you had been given authority by the government, you better treat people right. That's the way he felt. And I think that shows up in so much of his opinions, that if someone was, a state official, for example, and they weren't following the injunction of the Constitution to treat people well, that so deeply offended his sense of fairness and justice and order that he was just, he wasn't going to have it. And so so in that way, I don't think you could say he was conservative or not conservative, but I think more so the difference between Judge Johnson and George Wallace at bottom was that George Wallace didn't live his values, and Judge Johnson always did.
I wanted to ask, if I'm not mistaken, 1958, the three-judge panel, Judge Johnson, they ordered all of the parks to be integrated here in Montgomery. Oak Park was allowed to remain segregated, or they did for 15 years. How did that happen?
I don't know. I used to swim at Oak Park, and at some point it was closed. I think they ordered it to be integrated, but the pool certainly was closed. I don't know about the zoo. Yes, ma'am.
You sort of alluded to the question, the answer I'm seeking now when you spoke of the incident at the Eli Cafe with the
Yes, ma'am.
waitress responding to your being Judge Johnson's law clerk. How was Judge Johnson received in the white community in this city based on his civil rights rulings?
I'll give you my answer as somebody who grew up here and who also clerked for him. When we were growing up, I would think most of the white people in Montgomery really resented what Judge Johnson was doing. He was not popular at all. There were people like Clifford Durr and Virginia Foster Durr and some people like that who were what you might call the left-wing coterie of Montgomery. There are not very many in it, but I would say on the whole, early on, most of the white people really hated what he was doing. But I noticed by the time I clerked, a bunch of kind of establishment white people, typically the fathers of people our age, would come up to me and say, said, I wasn't too sure about Judge Johnson at first, but I have come to believe that he is doing, and certainly thinks he's doing, what is best for Montgomery and Alabama and doing his duty, and I am revising my thoughts about him. And I hadn't lived here in almost 50 years or more than 50 years, but my guess is by the people who are here, I just can't imagine there's all that much anti-Johnson feeling anymore, but I don't speak for Montgomery. Yeah. That would be my guess. Nobody ever says anything bad about Judge Johnson to me.
Even at the time and I was here, I started in 1975, so it was about a decade after most of the early decisions he had made about civil rights directly. I had some of the same experiences David did, where if I said I worked for Judge Johnson, there were some people who, nobody was ever aggressive, but they would let me know they didn't like it. But at the same time, there were so many people, white people, who admired him. And as I said earlier, Mrs. Johnson said the people, they knew their neighbors were their friends throughout the whole thing. And one thing that was so true about the whole civil rights movement in the South was yesterday morning we had the wonderful opportunity to hear Brian Stevenson talk about what he's doing and all his wonderful work. And he was talking about silence and how much that kept things the way they were. And that was true in certainly in the white community everywhere, that a lot of people just didn't know. And how they couldn't have, from our perspective today, it seems impossible, but the newspapers really, the local papers really didn't tell the story, the media didn't tell the story, and there's a way in which culture becomes blind, and so there were just a lot of people who just were clueless about what was going on. They probably had never heard of Judge Johnson. So I think it was a really mixed bag, even in 1975. But I'll agree, today I only hear people say what a giant of a man he was. And, I want to say the courage of all of the people who led the civil rights movement is, it's hard to even think how much courage it took. And, that Judge Johnson was able to be a support for those people was, his part in it. And that was to be admired as well. So thank you.
Judge Johnson was involved in I think Judge Johnson was involved in the desegregation cases here in Montgomery with the public schools. But I thought it was interesting that his wife, Mrs. Johnson, earned a graduate degree at Alabama State,
right.
in I think 71. Do you know the backstory to that?
I do, and the reason why, and I'll go back again, is that wonderful oral history that's on the court website. And what happened was, they had lived through that ordeal that they experienced, and they had, as you all know, death threats and cross burnings and all those kind of things that went on. And I will say the year that George and I were clerks was a very somber year, because it was the year that the Johnson's son Johnny died. And that was also, a terrible personal toll on them. And so it was, I think Mrs. Johnson had gotten a history degree at the University of Alabama, and she says all A's in her history degree. And she had been a teacher. And so she wanted to go back to work some. And so she did apply. She said, She thinks she was the first white person to apply to get a degree at Alabama State, but she's not sure, but she was certainly one of the first. She got her degree there, and then she went back to teaching, and she says that she was the first white teacher to teach in a predominantly African-American school, and that a friend of hers, an African-American teacher, was the first teacher to teach in a white school in Montgomery. And what she said was that, that it had gone pretty well when they both went back to do that. And so, you know, I want to say thank you. Mrs. Johnson they were a team. They were absolutely a team. And she was such a strong person and such a supporter. And in her own right, you know, she did so many things. And Judge Johnson adored Ruth and treated her with the utmost respect. And so that's how that happened, that she did that.
We've ceded to Bobby Siegel the right to call on
Yes,
people.
Hi. I just wanted to comment on the question about the white community response, not in Montgomery, but nearby. My father was on the school board, and in 1966, I remember as a child him getting served and having to come to his courtroom. Actually, Crenshaw County was not in the Dillard versus Lee. They had in 65 accepted 10 children under so-called freedom of choice when HEW threatened to pull all the money. But then the next year when more children wanted to come, they refused. And so I remember them coming and him coming back and saying, you know, he was, you know, they lost, but he said he was a fair judge and he was doing his duty. He was just following the law. So I think even those who were on the opposite side of some of his agreements, now they may not have, my dad, like you say, the silence, he may not have gone downtown and said that, but I think people knew that.
Yeah, thank you. And this is Martha Morgan, who is a law professor at the University of Alabama and has done so much wonderful work about human rights in her career. So thank you.
You referenced the Wyatt case. Mm-hmm. Could you give some insight onto how Judge Johnson felt, his feelings about that case?
Oh, yes, thank you. Wyatt, the mental health cases, that case had been decided several years before I clerked. Was it in the court?
It started when I was a clerk.
Yeah.
Bobby Siegel got appointed to part of the Wyatt case. Judge Johnson came to me and said, "Who should I appoint in the Wyatt case?" I said, "Bobby Siegel."
And sure enough, yeah.
The only important decision I ever made.
So I want to tell you that one of the things that happened when I was there, so it was several years and all the publicity had been out there, and Judge Johnson would get rafts of letters from people who had mental health issues, just dozens and dozens of letters people would write him. And sometimes people with mental health conditions would come to the courthouse. And in those days, there was zero security in the federal courts. The only way we ever had any security was if you happened to get on the elevator with an FBI agent between the first floor and the second floor, they would question you about where you were going. But otherwise, people just came and went, you know. And so periodically, people would just walk in. And when they did, Miss Perry, Judge's longtime secretary, knew that he wanted to talk to the members of the Wyatt class. And I remember him coming out of his, you know, that long walk out his office, and I can still see him putting his arm around the people, you know, who came in to talk to him. And sometimes they had grievances, sometimes they had really serious suggestions, and sometimes what they said was incomprehensible in a lot of ways. And he would stand there and nod and, you know, put his arm around their shoulder. and talk to them. And then they would leave, and they always seemed to leave feeling somewhat lighter, than they came in. So he felt really great compassion for the people who were impacted by the conditions there. The same thing was true in the prison cases. There were photographs, there was testimony about the conditions, and he really felt the impact of what our government had done to these people.
I just wanted to add a coda to what you said, David, about your experience at the Elite. So I clerked for him in 1985, 86, so about 12 years after you, 13 years after you, and I went with him to lunch at the Elite, and the same waitress came up to us and couldn't have been more fawning over Judge Johnson, practically patting him on the head. And
See what a great job I did with her.
yes, you did. and when she walked away, Judge said to me, "Did you see that?" I said, yes, Judge, I did. He goes, "Well, she wouldn't talk to me for 20 years."
I was a trial lawyer in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice from 1961 to 65, which brought me to Alabama lots of times. I just wondered if you would comment about the voting rights cases. I believe Judge Johnson held evidentiary hearings in Macon County and Bullock County and Elmore County. It's maybe before your time, but I'm sure you're familiar with the way he handled the courtroom presentations very strictly. The government lawyers were held to a high standard, and we knew that, and we were so extremely well prepared, you wouldn't believe it.
I'm sure.
So I've just appreciated if you would talk a little bit about his rulings in the voting rights cases.
I don't really know anything about the voting rights cases. That in my year, nothing happened like that.
Yeah.
I was not, I appeared before Judge Johnson, I think in 1964, in a couple of hearings in which he held, the issues were whether the registrars, I think in Bullock County and in Elmore, were following his decree. But those cases were full of tension. The Department of Justice, which was led then, John Doerr, who was a good friend of the Doers, supervised all those cases. And the Department of Justice's approach was to look at the voting records. We had the FBI photograph them, and the trial lawyers back in Washington, I was one of them, would spend hours and hours looking at those, at the photographs of the records. And what we were primarily looking at were the black efforts, the people who were attempting to register to vote, looking at how they filled out the forms, looking at their educational attainments, and contrasting it with a lot of the white persons who were given the privilege of voting while the black applicants were not. And it was on that basis that we brought most of those cases.
Thank you very much. I always hate to correct David Bagwell. He says he got me appointed to the Wyatt Stickney case. In fact, he got me appointed to the Lynch versus Baxley case,
You're right. That's right.
which dealt with the procedures for involuntary treatment. The Wyatt case, which deals with the right of treatment if you are involuntarily committed. We do have Ira Burnham, who is here somewhere back there, who later, after the original Wyatt case, spent years on the Wyatt case, tried the case because of enforcement things, and then went to the Bazelon Center, where he's the legal director, which specializes in mental health type issues. Does anybody have, we have about 2 more minutes. Does anybody have a comment or any quick?
I have one comment on voting. I'm 73 years old. When I was old enough to vote, I went down to register at the Montgomery County Courthouse to register to vote. And they said something like, "I'm sorry, honey, we're only open on the third full moon on Tuesday," or something like that. And I said, "I'm in college in Tennessee. I just can't do that." And she said, "Honey, don't tell anybody I told you this, but go over to the federal courthouse and they have federal voting registrars and tell them you want to register." So I registered with the federal voting registrars. You'd already fought the battles by then.
Y'all, we are going to resume our program at the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Church. We have buses, shuttles downstairs to take anyone who would like to attend. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Cathy, David.